The negotiations that go on cover every single sector imaginable, as well as working standards, labor standards, and environmental issues. I do think it's important when we talk about job loss to talk about the fact that jobs are lost in this country to many different reasons. One of them is to productivity. It takes far fewer people to operate equipment in machine plants and manufacturing facilities throughout the United States. One of my fears is exactly as you have mentioned, and that is right now we're seeing a lot of regulatory suggestions coming out of Congress that I think will make American companies very non-competitive. So again, I think we need to be concerned about this. We are fighting for fair trade. The free trade agreements are the best possible way to do this. And we have seen that we have a trade surplus with every single one of the countries with whom we have a free trade agreement. So again, I think we're using some terminology that needs to be changed. I agree with you. Fair trade is exactly what we're fighting for. So I think perhaps we need to work on some of the acronyms and some of the terminology that we're utilizing in Washington. But the fear is that American companies are going to be facing some regulatory issues that Congress is discussing right now that are certainly going to hurt the ability of American companies to compete.
I'm wondering if you can make a comment on a couple of trade issues we hear a lot about that I didn't hear you speak about before. One of them is, particularly in Europe, we have a lot of controversy over the fact that certain products are named by regions in that area, and American companies compete using those same region names, even though obviously they're not from that region. And secondly, from many other countries, we hear complaints about American very high subsidies for our agricultural products. Could you comment on those two things, please?
Well, I can also say to you, and I don't mean this answer to be a simple one, but it is, again, the value of negotiating free trade agreements. It is a way for us to regulate transparency within these countries. It's a way for us to regulate everything from terminology utilized on the products. And it is why we fight so hard and have made this a top priority, but we're moving very slowly in that direction. I don't think there will be any kind of a free trade agreement with the EU or European countries in the near future. I'm not even sure that once we get these 3 trade agreements that have been passed through Congress, that there will be additional ones in the near future. But again, those are exactly the reasons that these trade agreements are working. It's transparency, it's agreement on terminology, it's removing tariffs. What's happening throughout the world with the countries that we do not have trade agreements with, we're suffering duties levied not just on agricultural products, but on manufactured goods as well, often as much as 15 or 25%. What happens with the free trade agreements, and for example with Colombia right now, American companies that are shipping goods to Colombia are paying $2 million a day in unnecessary tariffs on everything from agricultural products through manufacturing products. On day 1 of the implementation of an agreement, 90% of those tariffs would be removed. So again, we don't have a competitive environment around the world, and that is what we're trying very hard to do by getting these trade agreements passed in order to give American companies. You still have to have the right price and the right product and the right buyer on the other end and financing and all of the other issues in place. But if you enter that market with a significant disadvantage of an unfair duty or tariff, you can't compete. So that is, again, the reason that we're fighting so hard to get these trade agreements passed.
Thanks for your insight into what's going to be happening in Washington, but an area that you didn't touch on is tax policy. The recently released Treasury Green Book actually has some very negative things in it with regards to international taxation. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Well, they only gave me 25 minutes to speak. And if they ever invite me back, I could go into some of these other issues that we're facing. The tax issue is a very serious one. And it is one that we're hearing absolute outrage, particularly from our small and medium-sized companies. And it is the regulatory issues that are being discussed right now, tax issues and others, are going to be very damaging to American companies' ability to be able to expand, not just globally, but even to be able to survive domestically. So we can talk about tax issues offline if you'd like, but I think it's an issue. We have a long list of priority items at the U.S. Chamber, and we call it the competitive agenda. And it's a pretty long list. It requires about an hour and a half of conversation, and Jim would not like that. So,
are you encouraging corporations such as General Motors to transfer production to foreign countries for sale back into the United States?
No, I'm not encouraging General Motors to do anything. I'm leaving that to our government right now that seems to be dealing the most with General Motors. No, I'm not encouraging that. I am encouraging them to be competitive and to be more efficient, and I'm much better equipped to talk about what small and medium-sized companies are doing to be competitive. And they're realizing that the productivity is possibly the enemy in all of this. Those would see it that way. But productivity is what has been able to cause American companies to do more with fewer workers. So we have to retrain those workers, and there is going to be a great effort on behalf of the administration to have more funds going into the training of American workers that have lost their jobs and will lose their jobs and continue to lose their jobs. But again, I go back to these success stories of these companies here in Northeast Ohio that people have never heard of, that are retooling their old types of manufacturing companies and turning them into innovative, prosperous companies. So I don't give advice to General Motors, but I do give advice to small and medium-sized companies. And I encourage them to understand their product and how they can adapt it to the world's marketplace. Export is a key to us getting out of this recession. And we have seen our export figures drop somewhat. They're lower right now during this period of 2009 than they were in the same period of 2008. And so it is imperative that, since they really are the engine that is driving this economy, they are 80% of our exporters are small and medium-sized companies. I think some new numbers came out today that number may have increased. And so those are the companies that we need to encourage to get involved in international business.
Would you comment on the agreements or lack of agreements that we had with Cuba and the effectiveness of our reactions to Castro as kind of a pick, not a real international diplomatic thing to do?
Well, I would agree with you. We feel very strongly, and I personally have felt this for a long time, that boycotts don't work. Business goes on, and business has gone on in Cuba. As I said, the debate is just starting regarding Cuba in Washington. This was hands-off for 8 years during the Bush administration. So you have a lot of people that have been chomping at the bit to get Cuba to remove some of these restrictions on Cuba. And as we've seen the first step in this, and I think this legislation that's being proposed right now to remove the travel ban is a next step in liberating our trade and our economic relationship with Cuba. I think this is going to happen over the course of the next several months. Again, I think it's going to be a very heated debate, because you really have, this is one that is a very emotional debate, but I think we have to admit the fact that we haven't been able to change what's happened in Cuba because of our embargo, so it's time to move on. And you're going to be seeing a big change in that, and we certainly at the U.S. Chamber are going to be supporting that.
8 weeks from today, our friend Ralph will be introducing the Governor of Ohio at the podium at City Club. If you were back in Cleveland in the audience, what would be the 2 or 3 things you'd tell him he ought to be doing to help us get more active?
Supporting Trade Routes Ohio, giving us the kind of support that we need to be able to reach out to the small and medium-sized business community. I think your governor's a great believer in, obviously, and understands foreign direct investment. He understands the significance of export, but I think it's very important that in this state, and I would love to have him take the leadership role in that, of communicating and educating your businesses in this state regarding international trade. So that would be my very first question. I'd ask him if he would lead that effort.